History 122 Domestic Policy 1945 to 1980. You can also find on Canvas History 122 Domestic Policy 1945-1980 notes. It's a blank template to help you with some of this information. This has less information than in your weekly reading, but it may help you with some of the content. Domestic policy starts 1945 with President Harry Truman leaving World War II. Now he has to focus on, okay, what about domestic policy? What about the United States with all these GIs coming home? What is the role of the United States? And so one thing is that as Americans are coming back by the millions to join the workforce, one thing that is going to be passed, the Taft-Hartley Act, which says you do not have to be forced to join a union when you want a job, which means it's prohibited as closed shop. When you see the term closed shop, it means you must be a member of a certain union to work here. On top of that, your dues, if you are part of a union, can not be made into political contributions. That is a violation of your rights. At the same time, it's outlaw sympathy strikes. It did permit right-to-work states. Virginia is a right-to-work state. You can join a union in Virginia, but it really has limited power. It really has no power at all, to be frank, but the right-to-work states. So there are issues with unions when he gets back. At the same time, when it comes to a civil rights issue, he will be the president to integrate the federal government and the military through executive orders 9980 and 9981 in 1948. And you ask, well, why did it have to be by executive order? Well, a lot of southern states would have blocked this. And so these two together desegregated federal government and the military. That's why in the Korean War you had integrated units. He also had what he called his fair deal, a fair deal for everyone. He's going to have a 21-point domestic program to help build up America after this war. Some examples of this domestic program include the expansion of Social Security for those who are disabled, for those who are unemployed. You have unemployment insurance through Social Security. Also expands the ages. He also, at the same time, increases minimum wage to 40 cents. Doesn't seem like a lot, but for a long time, minimum wage really wasn't that bad. Only in the last 20 years, 30 years, have we seen that minimum wage is way off the rate of inflation. On top of that, he'll have the Housing Act of 1949, which is going to create urban projects backed by the federal government and public housing projects to make housing and communities what he considered at the time, or they considered at the time, better than having all these rundown slums that were still around at the time. The one part of his 21-point domestic program that was not passed was his national health care insurance. It was prevented by a conservative coalition who said it's not the job of the federal government to provide health care. The United Kingdom, after World War II, started the National Health Service, so Harry Truman said, well, modern Western nation, we should do the same thing. That is still a debate today. What's the role? You have those that say it should be privatized health care. You have those like in the recent Democratic debates saying that it should be a national health care system. You had the Affordable Care Act under the Barack Obama administration. So there's a lot of different ways to look at this. Still a very, hot button issue today. Dwight D. Eisenhower gets elected in 1953. He is a Republican, but very moderate, very not political. He was elected because he was the general for Allied forces in the West, in France and in England, in those areas. So he was very popular. And the conservatives, or the modern Republicans, finally get into office for the first time since Herbert Hoover. And so they are going to reduce the scope of federal power. They always believe that states should have the most power, and a true conservative believes in small federal government and lower taxes. They believed in balanced budgets. The real last balanced budget the United States has had was in the mid-1990s when you had Bill Clinton, the Democrat, as president, but you had a conservative Congress, and they negotiated for a balanced budget. Conservatives also believe in pro-business policies, and especially at this time, business was expanding. It was exploding, low unemployment. So times were good during the 1950s. He also pushed for the creation of an interstate highway system. There were those who were against it. Why does the federal government have to create an interstate highway system? Eisenhower and others were able to convince Congress to do it, saying if there's a nuclear war, we need to have roads that can get troops and supplies to different parts of the country quickly and efficiently. Imagine trying to drive from Richmond to DC on Route 1, which is Brook Road and Jeff Davis Highway. That was going to take a long time. Take I 95, much quicker. And because of Sputnik being launched in 1957, Eisenhower's going to get passed the National Defense Education Act, which means pouring a lot of money into public schools, pouring a lot of money into math and science and advanced classes. When you get mad getting ready for those AP tests, well, those AP tests begin due to the National Defense Education Act. So thank you, President Eisenhower. And this is a interstate highway system. You can see on the East Coast, it's I-95 that goes from Florida all the way up to Maine. On the West Coast, from California up to Washington, it's I-5. And then if you're going to go across from east to west on the interstate highway system, those happen to be even numbers. There you go. Now, Dwight Eisenhower really took much of a back seat when it came to civil rights. But that didn't mean civil rights was going to end. There was a movement, especially after World War II, that things have got to change. And so the Brown versus Board of Education case is going to take place in 1954. It's actually 9 cases wrapped up into one. The group that's going to do this is the NAACP. The NAACP, since 1909, has tried to fight issues in the United States when it comes to civil rights. In the early 1950s, the NAACP decides, with our limited funds, we are going to attack the Jim Crow laws. We're going to attack Plessy versus Ferguson in the courts. They hire Thurgood Marshall. He is the lead attorney, and he is going to attack separate but equal. Now, Linda Brown. Linda Brown is from Topeka, Kansas, a moderate state. Her neighborhood was actually integrated, and her and her younger sister were forced to walk to the black school through a construction site, miles through a railroad track area, miles down the road, while her white friends go to the brand new white school right at the end of the street. And that's where the NAACP is going to make the argument. And their argument simply is segregation saddles blacks with a permanent sense of inferiority, caused ambition and self-esteem to drop, making Linda Brown see her friends go to the brand new white school, while her and her younger sister to go to a rundown black school. That does hurt her self-esteem. In 1954, the Supreme Court had changed. They were willing to make the correct decision. And they ruled that we conclude that in the field of public education, the doctrine of separate but equal has no place. Separate educational facilities are inherently unequal. Now, Southerners don't like this decision. So what they're going to do is they're going to look at the whole Supreme Court decision and say, where are there some loopholes? Where is there some leeway in this integration of schools? And they do find a line within the Supreme Court decision in which they say, got it. And part of that decision by the Supreme Court says schools must be free of racial discrimination with all deliberate speed. And there is that term, all deliberate speed. And Southerners will wrap around what they call massive resistance around that term. Massive resistance is Southerners were going to legally resist integration of schools by all lawful means. And all deliberate speed to African Americans means next year, next school year, we're ready to go. Southern whites will say, we're not ready yet. Make it 5 years, make it 10 years, make it 15 years. Also, at the same time, you notice public schools. And eventually, when the NAACP gets around to integrating public schools, that's when communities like Prince Edward County, they'll close the public schools and create private academies because that falls outside the realm of Brown versus Board of Education. Now, what really starts things is the Emmett Till case. And there's supposed to be a video here, but once I make this video, it will not allow me to run it. Emmett Till is from Chicago. He's 14 years old. And during the summer of 1955, he goes down to Muddy, Mississippi to live with his uncle Mose Wright. And he wants to pick cotton. He wants to make some money. And after a couple weeks down there, he's kind of showing off in front of some of his new friends he made. They're in the local town, very small town, like a one-road town. Then they're in front of the local store there. And Emmett Till's bragging about some of the friends he has up in Chicago. And he showed a picture of a couple of his classmates, and he tells, bragging to his friends, yeah, I date the white girl there. And they're like, oh, yeah, really, whatever. They're like, yeah. And they go, you're so cool. Why don't you go in there and say bye to that white woman who runs the store? So he goes into the store, and he comes back out, and he goes, I just said bye to the white woman. An old black man playing chess there jumps up and tells him, you better go back to your house because they're liable to come out of that store and shoot you. And so he goes back to Mose Wright's farm. In the middle of the night, there's a knock at Mose Wright's door, and it's the husband and brother-in-law of the woman in the store. And they want the kid who did all that trouble, who said bye to the white woman. And so Mose Wright, knowing how the system is and not wanting to get shot by these two gentlemen, gives up his nephew. A couple days later, the beaten and battered body of Emmett Till is found in the local river. And his body is brought back up to Chicago, where his mother, Mamie Till Bradley, insists on an open casket, as she says, so they can see what they did to my child. Ebony Magazine even publishes pictures of Emmett Till after the murder. Look those up. Very intense pictures. And so what ends up happening is there's a court case down in Money, Mississippi. You have the state prosecuting the two gentlemen. And the defense attorney doesn't really have to even do anything. He simply goes in front of the all-white jury and says, it is your Anglo duty to find these two defendants innocent. Really, the defense attorney's argument is the two defendants are white, you're white, the person who was killed was black, so you better find them innocent. It's your Anglo duty. And despite Mose Wright testifying against threats to his life that those were the two gentlemen who came and took Emmett Till, within an hour, the jury found the two white defendants innocent. A month later, for a fee of $3,000, the two defendants gave a magazine interview saying, yeah, we killed them. And they weren't really upset about it. Now, as history has kind of researched it, they go, well, what did Emmett Till actually do? Some people argue he actually went in there, bought candy, came back out and kind of bragged. That got him in trouble. Some people may have argued that, yes, he may have whistled at the woman to get her attention. And then some people argue that in the early 1950s, Emmett Till had a slight case of polio, which made it more difficult for him to start sentences. And so sometimes when he started a sentence, he kind of let out a whistle. And there's a lot of debate about that. 2 years ago, the woman who was still alive, very elderly at this point, came out and actually said Emmett Till did nothing, yet the kid was killed. But that just kind of highlights what it was like living in the South for African Americans. The all-white jury. And even when things were obviously, people were obviously guilty of something, no one changed anything. Now, where the civil rights movement really starts is in December of 1954. Rosa Parks is sitting in the black section of the public bus system. And when the bus gets too packed with white passengers, the bus driver tells Rosa Parks to stand up. And she says, I'm not standing up. I'm in the black section. Why should I stand up? And she'll be arrested. Even the arresting officer cannot explain to her why is she being arrested. He goes, I don't know. This is just the way things are. As a result, the African-American community is going to have a one-day bus boycott. And in interviews, a lot of the African-Americans who were involved with the one-day bus boycott were laughing, saying we were late to work because we wanted to see who was not taking the buses. And they said there was no African-Americans taking the bus. And that was so successful, the local black community said, well, we are going to make it a permanent bus boycott until the buses are integrated. And what's an interesting thing they did is they chose a brand new minister to Montgomery, Alabama. Montgomery, Alabama, by the name of, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. didn't want to lead the bus boycott because I'm brand new in the community. And a lot of the church leaders who've been there for a while goes, that's exactly why we want you. And so for over 365 days, over a year, this bus boycott lasted. You took black carpools, you took black taxis, or you walked. And the only reason Montgomery, Alabama gave in was because the NAACP went to court and the Supreme Court ruled that the Montgomery bus system must be integrated. The boycott worked, but still Montgomery was going to hold out. A next flashpoint of the civil rights movement is Little Rock, Arkansas. In 1957, the NAACP They got the local courts to say that yes, the Central High School in in Little Rock, Arkansas, must be integrated. So September 1957, 9 African Americans, chosen because of their good grades, attempted to integrate Little Rock Central High School. That picture you see on the screen, that is Governor Orville Faubus. Orville Faubus needed the white vote to be reelected, even though he was considered a moderate governor, and African Americans had voted for him before. And so what he ends up doing is he sends out the Arkansas National Guard to deny the Little Rock Nine from entering the school. And because of that, the Arkansas National Guard for a month guarded the school to make sure that no African Americans entered. Eventually, Dwight Eisenhower, who had really taken a back seat to civil rights issues, he invites, or basically orders, Governor Orville Faubus to meet with them. And Dwight Eisenhower gets Orville Faubus to remove the Arkansas National Guard. And Dwight Eisenhower assumes that, okay, fine, now this is going to go away and the school is going to be integrated. So Governor Orville Faubus removes the National Guard and just leaves local police to keep the peace when the Little Rock Nine integrate the school in October of 1957. And riots occur outside the school. The 9 students make it in, and there are police with them. But then outside, there's riots of hundreds and hundreds of white people, a lot of them not even from Little Rock, from other parts of the South. There were 3 black reporters there that got assaulted by this crowd. And the only reason the Little Rock Nine got out of there was because the police chief gave orders to the police cars that are escorting the students out. They go, drive and don't stop. If people get in front of you, run right over them. And this upset Dwight Eisenhower. It upset Dwight Eisenhower so much that he sent in the airborne of the armed forces, the Army. And for the whole 1957-1958 school year, the 9 students had escorts from class to class. And Ernest Green, the only senior, would graduate that spring. In order to resist this integration of schools, what did Little Rock do? They closed public schools. That's why there was no 1958-1959 school year. The local white population would say it was by order of the federal government. No, they simply didn't want to integrate. Another tactic was sit-ins. In 1961 in Greensboro, North Carolina, you had the Woolworths sit-in. 4 African-American students in the local college decided, it's very hypocritical that stores will allow African-Americans to purchase items from their store, but not use their lunch counters. And so these 4 students realized, we're going to have a sit-in. We are going to stop this. And so they were part of what's called SNCC, or the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And so these 4 gentlemen, they went into the local Woolworths, which is the department store, and they bought items first. They wanted to make sure that, look, we purchase items from your store, and now simply as customers with our receipts, we want to be served at the lunch counter. They sat down on the lunch counter and they were refused service. Even a local police officer who was ordered in there the first time to arrest them, even the local officer was kind of like, they're really not breaking the law. This is more of a department store policy. It's not the law itself. And so they were successful because the next day more African Americans arrived, and even more white students who were against this arrived. And eventually, after several months, Woolworths would give in, and sit-ins would spread throughout the South. And so this is a popular way to peacefully resist what they considered racist policies. Dr. King always used civil disobedience, peaceful means of going against what you considered unjust laws. Let the oppressor do all the violence. The oppressed should not fight back. Now, John F. Kennedy gets elected, and in 1961, there was another Supreme Court decision that integrates public transportation on interstate travel, which means where buses stop, whether different rest stops, different restaurants, wherever the buses stop in interstate travel must be integrated. And in order to make sure that it is integrated, you've got to challenge it. So in the summer of 1961, 40 college students, white and black, traveled on interstate buses throughout the South to make sure that wherever these buses stopped, that those places were integrated. And they went through Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, no problems. But they had been warned, if you go down to Alabama, there's going to be trouble. And when they reached Alabama, one of their buses would be firebombed. That's when John F. Kennedy would send down the army to protect the Freedom Rides or the Freedom Riders, to make sure that the laws are being followed. By 1963, there was only one city really holding out against integration, and that's Birmingham. Things are so bad in Birmingham, they literally called it Bombingham. And so in the spring of 1963, Dr. Martin Luther King is going to lead marches in Birmingham. His SCLC, or Christian Leadership Conference, is going to meet, organize marches. The problem was in Birmingham, they couldn't get adults to march. Because African American adults, what are they doing? Well, they're working. And so he'll be arrested several times. And during one of these times when he's arrested, he will write his famous letter from a Birmingham jail, in which he outlines why is he doing civil disobedience? Is he doing these marches? And really, in essence, he's going to say, we are doing this because every time African Americans are being told to wait and things will get better, this wait has almost meant never. That's why we are doing this. And so since African American adults are not joining in on the marches, he's going to go to local high schools. And they're going to meet at the 16th Street Baptist Church and march on downtown. Thousands of African American students between the ages of like 8 or 9 and 17 years old are going to march on downtown Birmingham. And it's the response by the Birmingham government that shocks Americans. Americans who are on the fence saying civil rights is a state issue, they look at this and go, what the hell is happening in the South? Because when these kids march on downtown Birmingham, they have dogs attack them. The one video footage that really shocks a lot of people is the Birmingham Fire Department using fire hoses against them. And so many kids are being arrested, they get arrested and they get immediately released. And this was so successful, and public opinion swayed so much against Birmingham, Birmingham would give in. It's called the Birmingham Truce. And they say, we will integrate department stores, we will integrate lunch counters, we will integrate the downtown, we will integrate even dressing rooms. And while this was happening, John F. Kennedy is witnessing this and says, he contacts Dr. King and says, all right, enough is enough. The federal government now is actively going to pass laws to make sure that the rights of African Americans are protected, because marches take time. When the SCLC goes into marches, it takes months, it can take weeks, it takes a long time. Also, the NAACP going through the courts, that takes time. John F. Kennedy tells Dr. King that, look, what the federal government passes laws, now rather than going on marches and going to the courts, you can appeal directly to the executive branch, and the executive branch can solve this in a week or two. He says, just calm down. But Dr. King was smart. He says, this is the time to calm down. It's time to put more pressure on the system. So in August of 1963, it's going to be the March on Washington. August 28, 1963, over 200,000 people peacefully marched to Lincoln Memorial in D.C. And it's really to show Kennedy and others in the federal government that, yeah, you've got to pass laws to protect us. This is the area, this is the time where Dr. King gave his famous I Have a Dream speech. Now, John F. Kennedy would not see the passage of the civil rights legislation because on November 22nd, 1963, he'll visit Dallas, Texas. Presidents, visit different parts of the country. There is Jackie Kennedy and John F. Kennedy, and sitting right in front of John F. Kennedy is the governor of Texas. They're in an open car, driving around, waving at local Texans. When they drove around Dealey Plaza, which is downtown Dallas, you can see from this chart that they passed by the Texas School Depository. And most people working for the Texas School Depository are down on the streets waving at the president, except for one person. A gentleman who had newly been hired by the name of Lee Harvey Oswald. He tells his coworkers, no, I'm going to stay up here and eat my lunch. Lee Harvey Oswald has an interesting background. He early on had joined the Marines. Then he left the Marines, became a communist, spent time in the Soviet Union. His wife is even from Russia. And before he was working at the Texas Book Depository, he was pretty much a communist handing out leaflets why the United States or why Castro was good. And so what ends up happening as John F. Kennedy cars passes from the 6th story of the Texas Book Depository, Lee Harvey Oswald is going to fire 3 shots and kill John F. Kennedy. You notice a lot of people would say it's a conspiracy. There's no way that Lee Harvey Oswald could fire 3 shots, because if you look at the footage, it looks like the car is going from left to right across the screen. Well, actually, the car, if you notice, is actually driving away from Lee Harvey Oswald, so it's really not as difficult to fire off 3 shots. Plus, he scored pretty well in his for the Marines as a sniper, so he could fire a gun. And so this is Lee Harvey Oswald a couple weeks before the actual assassination, with the rifle that he would use, and the paperwork with it, because he says he's going to kill the president. He'll be arrested. And after a couple days in the Dallas jail, he is being marched through the basement of the Dallas jail to be taken to a federal prison. He's being marched really in front of the media. And out of the crowd jumps a gentleman by the name of Jack Ruby, who had simply walked into an opening through the garage of the Dallas jail. He jumps out and fires 1 shot into Lee Harvey Oswald's stomach. Lee Harvey Oswald will die. And we don't know why Jack Ruby did it. He would die of cancer in 1967. Lee Harvey Oswald always says, I'm Apache. There's more people. There's more people. There'd be a big commission. There's always these conspiracy theories, but the Warren Commission in 1969 simply ruled that Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone, although there's a lot of people say he didn't. As a result, Lyndon Johnson would become president. The reason Lyndon Johnson was made vice president for Kennedy, because Lyndon Johnson had a long, illustrious career in the House of Representatives. He also was from Texas, to balance out the Massachusetts-Texas ticket. And Lyndon Johnson will create his War on Poverty and Great Society program. And by that time, there's a lot of Americans. You say 40 million. Well, yeah, that'd be like 100 million Americans today living in poverty. And so he creates the Office of Economic Opportunity, the OEO. And that's where today we have the Head Start programs, the Job Corps for vocational education, especially in the cities, literacy programs for the cities, legal programs for the underserved and lower economic Americans. This is the program that creates food stamps. He is trying to help out people who live in poverty, which the government really never focused on before. He goes, we've got to fix this. At least give them a little bit of a safety net. On top of his war on poverty, he's going to create something called the Great Society. This is where we create Medicare. When you guys retire and hit the age of 65, Medicare kicks in, and it's going to cover a majority of your medical bills. It's a health insurance program for those 65 or older, or those that also fit into other categories if you're below the age of 65. But for the most part, it's old age health insurance. On top of that, he also creates Medicaid, government-paid health care for the poor or disabled. You must qualify for Medicaid. If you make too much money, you can't qualify for it. But it is to help people that don't really have the money to purchase private health insurance on their own, or health insurance through their job. He's trying to help people. He also creates a new immigration law. The immigration law since 1921 really only favored immigrants from Western Europe. Under his new laws, it increases immigration opportunities for Asians and people from Latin America. He's saying we are ignored a lot of different areas in the world, and by the 1960s, the world has shifted where immigrants are coming from. And finally, he's going to put money. This is going to set up money to set up the PBS and NPR, the Public Broadcasting System, and the National Public Radio. Now, even though John F. Kennedy said he's going to start it, Lyndon Johnson would be the one who is involved with the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 is very similar to the 14th Amendment and other Supreme Court rulings. But remember, those take time. If you want to challenge civil rights using the 14th Amendment, you got to go through the courts, and that could take years. The Civil Rights Act makes it much easier. Makes segregation of public facilities illegal. Remember, that's why you had those Supreme Court cases. That's why you had the marches, and those take time. Gave the federal government powers to enforce school desegregation. Now, if you feel that school is not truly desegregated, you can appeal directly to the executive branch, and they can do that in weeks to solve this issue. Also, set up the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission to end racial discrimination in employment. Why didn't you get hired? Well, if you can prove that it's because of your race, you can appeal to this commission, and they can go after the company. Why were you fired? if you can prove it was without cause, was due to racial issues, you can appeal to this commission. It doesn't mean it's 100%, but there is an extra layer of protections because believe me, the United States had quite a history of last hired, first to be fired, as we all knew when we talked about de facto segregation in the North during the Great Migration period from 1890 to about 1930, led to the passage of the 24th Amendment, which banned the poll tax in order to vote. Many southern states know that African Americans had lower end jobs and didn't have a high income. Well, put a poll tax in there. Oh, you want to vote, you got to pay a tax. Well, that's too expensive. Okay, well, then you can't vote. So that's why you created the 24th Amendment. He was also there, had the Voting Rights Act in 1965. And really, what did it outlaw? Believe it or not, guys, we already worked on this. Literacy tests. Remember the Louisiana literacy tests we took? 30 questions in 10 minutes. Some of them were confusing. Some of them were quite easy, like spell backwards, forwards. Others a little bit more confusing when they said draw this with this dot, with that X on the southwest corner, but don't touch this side. They outlawed that stuff. And you can see statistically, like in Mississippi, voting goes up 700%, Virginia 100%, Alabama almost 300%, and provided federal registers, which means you have people representing the federal government to go down to some of these underserved areas or areas that are traditionally discriminated against, and these federal registers will register African Americans to vote and make sure they have the opportunity to vote, to make sure there's no shenanigans by the local white population to deny them the right to vote. And April 4th, 1968, really the end of the civil rights movement as we know it from the 50s and 60s occurs when Dr. Martin Luther King will be assassinated. Now, since the federal government got involved in the civil rights movement, Dr. King has been trying to figure out, well, what's my next move? How do I still be active? And he really became a champion for the lower classes, the working class. On April 3rd, 1968, the day before his assassination, he gave a speech to striking sanitation workers in Memphis, Tennessee. And he wanted to make things better for the working man. Even in that speech, he talks about, I can see the promised land. I'm probably not going to get there with you, but you guys will make it. He actually kind of foresees his death. And he'll be shot and killed while waving to a couple of supporters outside his hotel room in Memphis, Tennessee. And there will be riots across the United States. I ask you, if you really are interested, type in Dr. King's last speech. It's kind of eerie knowing that he is going to die the next day. And if you really want to see an interesting speech, is Robert F. Kennedy. He is giving a speech that night, April 4th, 1968, while running for the Democratic nominee for president. He gives a speech in Indianapolis, Indiana, where he has to tell the people, majority black, that Dr. King's been shot. Then he gives an impassioned speech of why we must not riot. And Indianapolis didn't have any riots that night. It's real interesting going from King to RFK. Now, Richard Nixon gets elected. He gets elected on Vietnamization to end the Vietnam War, because despite the social aspects of the Vietnam War happening in America with the hippies and the anti-war protests on college campuses and all the music and political music being developed, he says, look, most Americans are this silent majority. They support the United States government in Vietnam and they'll support the Vietnamization process, but they're just not in front of the media. And he calls this silent majority World War II veterans, people living in the Midwest, the South, those blue-collar, hardworking Americans, the suburbs, rural America. They will support me as I withdraw American soldiers from Vietnam. He's also, even as people think, well, Republicans don't really care about this stuff, he is the first president that really had a concern for our environment. He will create the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA. He will also pass the first Clean Air Act of 1970. And so he did several things. But unfortunately, he's paranoid. And yes, that is actually a real picture of Richard Nixon and Elvis Presley. Elvis Presley was in D.C., asked to meet the president. So Richard Nixon said, sure, it's Elvis. And Elvis wanted to help Richard Nixon in the war on drugs, and even wanted to be a member of the DEA and go undercover, even though Elvis had a drug problem himself. And Nixon's like, thank you very much. Here's an honorary badge. Thanks, Elvis. Now, Nixon is kind of paranoid. He's always thinks people are out to get him, which is a bad thing. And he is going to win re-election in 1973. I mean, 1972, 73. There's no doubt. But he's paranoid of what do the Democrats have on me? What are they going to find? And so a group called the Committee to Re-elect the President, or CREEP, they are basically operatives to collect information on the Democrats. And in 1973, June of 72, they'll be caught. They'll be caught breaking into the Democratic National Headquarters at the Watergate Hotel. The Watergate Hotel is just over the Potomac River in Washington, D.C. The first couple floors are business offices, and they're caught. And that should have ended it. Some of the men were gone to jail for breaking and entering. Some just, nothing really happened to them. But then two newspaper reporters from the Washington Post, Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, they've got a source. And the source basically says, CREEP, they're there. Not only did Richard Nixon know about the break-in, he ordered the break-in, now he's trying to cover it up. And so Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, they start publishing this in the Washington Post. And their source, they just simply name him Deep Throat. Now, you can imagine Deep Throat was the name of a popular adult movie at the time. But Woodward and Bernstein said, we are not giving up our source. And eventually, about 40 years later, everyone found out their source because a gentleman was elderly and was dying. Their source was by the name of a gentleman by the name of Mark Felt, who was like second in command of the FBI. And he felt what Richard Nixon was doing was wrong. He had also been passed over for a promotion, so you make that decision. But he was feeding them information. And so a special prosecutor is appointed by Congress to gather all this information. What did Richard Nixon know? When did he know it? What is his relationship to CREEP? What is his relationship to the break-in? How is he trying to cover this information up? And Richard Nixon didn't like this because the guy was getting closer and closer and closer to filing impeachment charges. And so we call it the Saturday Night Massacre, October 20th, 1973. What does Richard Nixon do that upsets Democrats and even Republicans a lot? He fires the special prosecutor, Archibald Cox. That's why Donald Trump, when you had the special prosecutors investigating him this past year over the Ukraine incident, his conversation, Donald Trump didn't fire him even though he wanted to. And you could tell by what Donald Trump said, he wanted to fire him. He knew if he fired a special prosecutor that all hell was going to break loose, because that's what happens to Richard Nixon when he fires a special prosecutor. He will argue, I am not a crook. But now he's really lost his base. He's lost his Republican base. He's even lost what he calls his silent majority. What's going to end up happening in August 9th, 1974, he is going to resign. They were going to file impeachment charges. He was going to be impeached, and he was going to be removed from office. But he resigns. The picture on the right, there's Richard Nixon leaving the White House for the last time. And then Gerald Ford, one of his acts domestically, which was unpopular at the time and is still debatable today, he will pardon Richard Nixon. And when he goes in front of the TV cameras, he is going to say, my fellow Americans, our long national nightmare is over. I pardon Richard Nixon. Let's move on. Some people said, that's fine. Other people said he should have been thrown in jail. Just your perspective.